A quick like and subscribe really helps our channel grow and allows us to bring you even more amazing content. Thank you for your support.
Growing up, the whispers of our family warned of a place lost to time, a dense, ancient forest bordering our property, shrouded in mist and mystery. My grandma, the keeper of family lore, would lean in close each holiday dinner, eyes aglow, recounting tales of fairies dwelling within the tangled woods, guardians of nature's secrets. She claimed they weren't the fluttering, benign sprites of children's books, but rather sentinels, fiercely protective, easily aggrieved. It was tradition that every autumn, before the first frost, we set a table at the forest's edge, a makeshift family dinner where we'd ceremoniously leave offerings, honey, milk, and warm bread for the forest dwellers. My sister, Lisa, ever the skeptic, called it our weird family picnic and viewed it as an eccentricity we indulged in for Grandma's sake. But there was an unspoken understanding, a silent agreement to never skip this ritual. That was until last year when Lisa insisted we stop pandering to old superstitions. Yet, that night, I dreamed fitfully of the forest, shadows twisting and trees whispering my name, beckoning, and pleading. Morning broke with a chilling freeze, a stark contrast to the unseasonably warm October. Despite my reservations, I agreed with Lisa in not performing the ritual that year, more out of annoyance than belief. Over dinner that evening in the comfort of our home, the air seemed heavier, the tick of the old clock in Grandma's dining room slicing through silence louder than I ever remembered. We exchanged half-hearted laughs, the eerie quiet broken only by the occasional clink of dinnerware. Halfway through the meal, the lights blinked out, plunging us into darkness. It wasn't a simple power outage, it felt deliberate, like being swallowed by a void. Panic simmered just beneath the surface as I fumbled for my phone. When the dim glow of its screen pierced the gloom, I caught a glimpse of Grandma's face etched with an expression I would never forget, fear layered beneath a mask of resignation. Suddenly, the front door creaked open, no wind outside, just sheer unnatural force. An icy dread pulled in my stomach, and in the dim light streaming through, figures stood silhouetted against the doorway, not people, but tall, lithe shapes, eyes glinting with otherworldly light, blending with the shadows of the forest. They made no sound as they slipped into the house, weaving between us, untouched by the walls. The very air around us thickened with an ancient power, reeking of the forest's damp rot. My grandma whispered something in a language soft and unfamiliar, her tone one of supplication or command, I couldn't be sure. But the figures paused, turning towards her as if understanding. For what felt like an eternity, time ceased its relentless march forward. And then, just as suddenly as they appeared, the silhouettes retreated into the night, leaving the door ajar, forest air mingling with the scent of our abandoned dinner. Light blinked back to life as if it had never left, leaving only an unsettling stillness in its wake. My family sat frozen, utensils suspended mid-bite, trying to comprehend the inexplicable intrusion. Grandma finally broke the silence, her voice firm and even. "We upset the balance," she declared. "We deprived them of their due." I wanted to speak, to challenge the absurdity of it all, but words failed me. Logic had crumbled. The remnants of the dinner lay forgotten as we stumbled to the porch, the forest looming dark and unyielding. And there, at its edge, unmistakably new yet ancient all the same, stood a venerable oak, gnarled and grand, a sentinel showing gratitude, or perhaps a warning. This was a game without end, a balance never to be taken for granted. Our lineage was tied to this place, bound by invisible threads spun long before us. The lesson burrowed deep beneath our skin, a reminder that what resides in the eternal thicket respects neither disbelief nor disregard. That night, as I lay in bed, I knew with certainty that some promises must never be broken, and not all family dinners are meant for us alone. When my friend Eric disappeared, the last place anyone expected to find him was the labyrinthine cave system known as Devil's Maw, a sprawling network of tunnels that twisted like the vines of an ancient curse beneath our sleepy town. You see, Eric wasn't the type to wander off into the unknown, especially not into places that had legends about people going missing. I went there alone, driven by a gut feeling that majorly felt wrong but was impossible to ignore. The sun was waning when I arrived at the cave's gaping entrance. A chill ran through the wind, whispering unsung warnings as the first stars flickered hesitantly in the dimming sky. People said the Devil's Maw swallowed light and spat darkness, and as my flashlight battled shadows, I felt those words lick at my spine. Each step echoed back eerily, a sinister mimicry of my every movement. The air grew colder, heavier, carrying an earthy musk intertwined with a hint of something metallic, blood? My breath shallow, competing with a chorus of bats that flitted like startled shadows, seeking refuge deeper within the caverns. The last contact from Eric had been a garbled voicemail, his voice strained, desperately cryptic, "Find me where the winds call between the stones, where shadows dance and light hesitates." That was it. Friends dismissed it as a prank. Eric's idea of a joke, after all, was an enigma wrapped in dark humor, but this felt different. Something in his tone clung to my bones and wouldn't let go, compelling me into this malevolent moi. The narrow tunnels branched unpredictably beneath my fingers that skimmed the jagged walls, now and then snagging on the sinister protrusions that seemed to reach for a taste of vitality. Something was watching me, yet nothing was there. My own heartbeat amplified, a war drum in these corridors to hell, urging both retreat and relentless pursuit. "Eric!" I called into the void, my shout devoured by the hungry silence. It felt endless, and if not for those sporadic, resonant drips of the cave's tears, I might have succumbed to the illusion of an infinite labyrinth. Time, in this place, dilated, an elastic nightmare stretching beyond comprehension or sanity. Hours, or days, it felt the same, passed, and just when despair began coiling tight around my resolve, I heard it, faint strains of laughter, choked and maniacal like laughter heard from a broken old gramophone. The sound entered through one ear, exiting the other, carrying a harrowing familiarity. Could it be Eric? I pressed forward, veering into a cavity where the ceiling yawned upwards, swallowed by shadows darker than blindness itself. The laughter crescendoed, morphing into a cry, a sharp, visceral clutch of horror that shattered resolve into shards, which I frantically pieced together as they fell. "Eric!" I shouted again, sprinting towards a speck of flickering light, an amber pulse in the distance like a heartbeat given form by the stillness. The passage expanded, its walls alive with undulating shadows that mocked my every move, swelling in their deception. The light drew closer, though its warmth remained cruelly unreachable. Emerging at the mouth of a cavern wider than imagination allowed, stalagmites clawed upwards, and there, their sinister poetry, sat Eric, crumpled like a forgotten puppet. His eyes were impossibly wide, orbs reflecting nightmares wholly absorbed. His mouth was in an eternal silent scream, frozen in eerie laughter. I stepped forward, my own laughter involuntarily mimicking his petrified facade. Then, the terrible truth, Eric's lips moved, seamlessly in a wordless prayer to this wretched abyss. The light was not a torch or any human illumination but something that emanated from the very rock, a mineral essence refracting impossibilities that blurred reality. Getting closer, I realized it was as if his very skin absorbed the glow, not reflecting it but symbiotically entangled with whatever resided within these stones. "Eric!" I pleaded, my voice carrying its shakiness like a forbidden burden. He turned slightly, somehow more rigid and fluid than a human should be capable of. His eyes bore into mine, yet he saw something else entirely, a vision beyond human grasp. "The maw demands," he whispered, incongruent laughter threading each syllable. He pointed a skeletal finger towards the pit at the cavern's core, a blackness so absolute it devoured reality. The laughter grew within me as I approached, unbidden yet unshakable, harmonizing with the fractured echoes of the place. My will, to retreat, to save Eric, to survive, struggled in futility against the rising instinct to dive deeper, to understand what lay beneath the veil of reason this place obliterated. As I followed his lead, I felt not myself but something far vaster, seething beneath the surface of perceived sanity. In that moment, standing at the precipice, Eric's expression shifted, fathomless and enlightened, yet fundamentally absent. He tilted forward, folding into the black so smoothly he became one with it. The echo of his impact was not a sound but a resonance felt within my bones. I reached after an impulse for salvation or sense, the void reaching back, a cold embrace that seared with madness too enticing to resist. I never found Eric again, nor myself, really. When I was later found babbling on the outskirts of town, eyes hollowed by horrors unspoken, they asked if I was okay. I met their gaze, lips stretching mechanically, yet there's nothing joyful in my expression. The laughter remains tethered, steadfast at the corners of my mouth, a reflection of unspeakable truths. Now I'll never smile again. The maw saw to that. Late one night, I found myself standing in line outside a decrepit old theater on the edge of town. Despite its crumbling facade and fogged glass windows, the place had drawn quite the crowd. People murmured excitedly about a new kind of cinematic experience being touted as life-changing. It was called the Mirage event, and entries were strictly limited. Invitations were whispered, not advertised. I'd heard about it from an older co-worker who swore it would unveil the perfect version of your life, showing you how to achieve it if you followed the steps they revealed inside. I was desperate. My life felt like a book stuck on the same page, and I hoped this could be my turning point. As I stood there, a routing marquee above us casting an ominous glow, I noticed the unconventional way the line was being monitored. A stern figure in a vintage usher uniform with a face like a forgotten dream seemed to float between groups, inspecting each person. The theater had promised the experience to the first 100 people in queue, and I was around the 85th. As minutes crawled by, the haphazard line formed naturally, but tension simmered when a frenzy of late arrivals started disputing who was there first. That's when a glimmer of an idea flickered in my mind, a way to gain an edge. Amidst the unrest, I casually suggested organizing the inchoate line based on physical position rather than mere arrival time, downplaying any notions of fairness while others debated. Surprisingly, my proposal took root, and people began to shuffle around according to the ragged physical line I started to establish. In the confusion, a couple ahead of me got pushed to the back of this newly formed line. Their protests were lost in a cacophony of rustling coats and disgruntled murmurs. It was as if the crowd shared a collective eagerness to order through chaos, so rationalizing any doubts was quickly glossed over. But as I slipped into the prime zone, a strange aura seemed to encircle the place. The air was impossibly thicker, oppressive, and the night colder, almost whispering my name. I didn't notice until later, when the theater doors creaked open, how an unearthly silence swept through the crowd. A hush that spoke of secrets guarded for lifetimes. It sent shivers down my spine yet pulled me in with an irresistible force. One by one, people started moving inside, disappearing into the shadowy maw of the Mirage event. I was buzzing with anticipation when the usher caught my eye, their gaze piercing through me like a blade. There was no malice, but something else. Almost as if they knew my thoughts and didn't mind, or maybe they wanted me to carry the burden of my choices inside. As I crossed the theater's threshold, the atmosphere changed instantly. A sense of dread mixed with curiosity enveloped me. The interior was an otherworldly blend of ornate deco from yesteryears and a technological setup that seemed straight out of a fever dream. Rows of luxurious, velvet seats stretched out before the screen, each adorned with a small plaque that somehow bore the name of the occupant, mine included, though I know I never shared it aloud. It felt intimate, heavy with the knowledge of strangers who were no longer strangers. When the lights dimmed further, a low hum reverberated from the walls, a signal that the miracle was about to begin. The screen flickered to life with images too vivid to be real, but too personal to dismiss as fiction. I witnessed snippets of my childhood, anniversaries that never happened, and a life of dazzling happiness and fulfillment, a dream reality, only it wasn't mine, it was what could be. This perfect life, with all its impossible ups and few downs, unraveled before me in a sequence that seemed just out of reach. Temptation took hold. Was this what the others saw? Or did these revelations change according to who was watching? I never got to ask anyone as their faces blurred, lost to their own visions. As the film progressed, offering pathways and decisions I had shied away from in life, my mind grappled with guilt and longing. I forgot about the choices made moments earlier in line placement, the usurpation of fairness for strategic gain. Here, my life and its paths were laid bare, scrutinized and judged not by anyone else but by myself. Each revelation felt like a judgment day compressed into fleeting moments. The conclusion of this eerie saga wasn't the end, rather, it instigated a weighty silence, enforcing a reflection many weren't ready to accept. People left the theater in various states of mind, some weeping, others frantic with excitement perhaps over newfound purpose, while a few were silent, their faces masks concealing the chaos within. As I exited, I was still processing, yet troubled by a singular thought that wouldn't let go. It dawned upon me, a chilling realization that in my quest for self-betterment, I'd potentially altered someone else's course in line, a metaphorical and literal theft of destiny. Had I robbed those people of witnessing their best paths for the night? Was my eagerness damning them to mediocrity? The usher's knowing gaze replayed in my mind, suddenly colder, more condemning. It haunted me as I drove home, the quiet ride back punctuated by the echoes of choices made. For now, the infinite possibilities seemed closed off, sealed by my hastily bought decision. Even the reflective Lady Moon veiled herself behind clouds, unimpressed by earthly matters. I wondered if, given the opportunity, I could revisit that line and change my approach. But deep down, I feared the most haunting truth of all, that opportunities such as these are one-shot, unforgiving of arrogance and haste. And so, as I lay in bed, surrounded by whispers of imagined perfections, I questioned aloud, was I the antagonist of my own life's story? My dreams that night were filled with spectral figures waiting in lines that never ended, each step echoing with something just out of reach, a tantalizing promise of a life edited by choice, or lack thereof. I never thought a simple prank could spiral so wildly out of control, until my best friend, Jake, decided to play a game with fate, and now I can't escape the guilt clawing at my conscience. It all started on a balmy Friday night, the moon cloaked behind a veil of clouds, casting an eerie glow over the streets of our small town. We had gathered, as we often did, in the cramped living room of Jake's rundown apartment, the place reeking of stale beer and musty secrets. The guys, pumped on adrenaline and bad decisions, exchanged wicked grins as Jake tossed a crumpled piece of newsprint on the coffee table. "Check this out," he said, his eyes alight with mischief. The article was about an urban legend, a haunted house rumor that had taken our town by storm, whispering tales of a cursed spirit lingering in the shadows, bestowing night terrors on trespassers. Jake, ever the thrill seeker, suggested we do the milk prank of doom, an absurd challenge we'd concocted years back that involved smashing a gallon of milk in a supposedly haunted location and recording our escape before the ghostly consequences trailed us home. Everything inside me screamed to shut it down. I'd heard too many tales of people tempting fate only to end up on the wrong side of a horror story, but Jake wouldn't hear it. "Come on, Greg," he urged, the others egging him on, "it's just a prank." But the sickening feeling in my gut told me this wasn't like the other times. "Jake, I don't think this is a good idea," I warned, but my apprehension only fueled his determination. As they prepared for the impending escapade, I decided to bail, leaving Jake and the rest with a lingering stare that screamed a silent don't. Later that night, the air electrified with a sense of foreboding, and sleep evaded me. I lay in my bed, eyes flickering between shadows, where every creak felt like an omen of disaster, haunted, perhaps, by the stillness of knowing I should have done more. When my phone buzzed frantically at 2 a.m. with messages from a number I didn't recognize, my heart plunged into an icy grip. Each word I read sent chills down my spine. It was Jake, desperately pleading for help, the texts riddled with typos and panic, "Trapped, can't get out, and she's here." Against my better judgment, guilt drowning out reason, I grabbed my keys and tore through the streets, my car's engine screaming beneath the oppressive night. My headlights cut through the murky fog as I arrived at the decrepit old house leaning into the night like a specter, its windows gaping voids, the air alive with an unnatural silence that prickled my skin. I found the door slightly ajar, and from within echoed distant cries, a series of stunted breaths and Jake's muffled cries for mercy. As the haunting chill seized me, every instinct screamed to turn back, but the pull of friendship, and fear of what could already be too late, drove me deeper into the bowels of the house. The air grew colder, pressing against me with unseen weight as I moved through the dust-filled corridors of ghostly echoes, the scent of rottenwood and something far more sinister clinging to the air. My flashlight flickered, casting unsettling shadows that danced across the peeling wallpaper, which seemed to whisper a forgotten story, all the while my heartbeat mimicking the rhythm of a death knell. Suddenly, out of the blackness, Jake's voice pierced the veil of shadows, a grotesque half-laughter, half-sob that reverberated around me. "Greg, she's here. She's real," his voice babbled incoherently. I found him in a corner, eyes wide with terror, taut with the maddening grip of an unseen fear. The weight of my earlier warning hung between us like a curse fulfilled, and in that moment, I realized the true horror of our folly. Whatever malevolent force Jake had disturbed, it was far beyond our understanding or control, as if the house itself pulsed with a life of its own. We didn't have time for apologies or regrets. Time seemed to twist and distort as we retraced our steps back to the entrance, the air thickening with every step as the walls began to close in, urging us towards a madness that lingered just out of reach. Just as we burst through the threshold, gasping for the night's chill air, the door slammed behind us with a finality that echoed our severed connection to the world we thought we knew. The scars of that night etched themselves into Jake's and my reality. He was never the same, his laughter replaced with the echo of that haunted sob, and my warnings, once ignored, whispered a haunting reminder of the line we'd crossed. Time passed, but the grip of that night never loosened, and for Jake, the boundaries between reality and nightmare forever blurred. Perhaps I was the asshole for not stopping him, perhaps the true horror lies not in the unknown, but in the things we dare not to believe, lurking just beyond the edge of our own hubris. When I entered nursing, I expected long hours, exhaustion, and occasionally ungrateful patients, but what nobody prepared me for was the night my past came clawing back, leaving bloody fingernail marks on the thin veneer of my normal life. A year ago, I was a nurse in the psychiatric unit of a hospital in a town that's more tombstones than people, a place where whispers of the past cling to the air like the persistent fog rolling off the hills at dusk. Our patients ranged from those haunted by shadows in their minds to those dangerously enthralled by the darkness. One such patient was Lester, a middle-aged man with sad eyes and a spine-chilling calmness. Lester was admitted after a series of bizarre incidents in his neighborhood, pets disappearing and strange symbols carved into garden gnomes. He'd often ramble about a glaring unseen and warn anyone who would listen about an impending cosmic reckoning. He was there for months, slipping through different levels of consciousness like a clock gone haywire, sometimes lucid enough for a chess game, other times scrawling frantic, encrypted messages with whatever writing instrument he could find. Then, one stormy night, Lester vanished, just like that, disappearing without so much as a sound or trace. We assumed he slipped out during a power outage, a theory that, albeit convenient, always felt like a thin veil over some hideous truth. For months, my sleep was plagued by dreams of Lester, standing at the foot of my bed, eyes wide and fixed on an unfathomable point behind me, mouthing words I couldn't quite decipher. Despite the hospital's reassurances that Lester was no longer a concern, a flickering candle of paranoia danced at the edges of my mind. Eventually, time did its sneaky trick of laying a fog over past horrors, and I moved to a new city, started at a different hospital, and even managed a sense of peace in the mundane motions of everyday life. That is until last Tuesday, when peace was pulled violently from beneath me. It started with letters. The first few I assumed were junk, plain envelopes with no return address, but the handwriting, jagged and frantic, demanded recognition. Each contained the same cryptic message: the games are not over. The sacrifice is you. Slowly, the overwhelming fear that Lester had found me gripped me in its cold embrace. My heart pounded as the letters increased in fervor and frequency, the content becoming an escalating series of threats and cryptic babbling about cosmic gates and my supposed role in safeguarding something priceless. Anxiety bled into every aspect of my life, shadowing me at work and wrapping its tendrils around each ounce of joy, squeezing it dry. When the letters abruptly stopped about 3 days ago, a foolish hope dared to bloom that it might finally be over. Last night shattered that hope. After an exhausting shift, I sunk into the couch, every muscle pleading for rest, when the sharp trill of my doorbell ripped through my drowsiness. The sight of the unassuming delivery man on my doorstep was my last rational moment. He handed me a package that contained a battered chess piece, the White King, and a note: "Your move." Panic twisted my gut as memories of chess games with Lester flickered back, his intense gaze, how he'd insist the games were more than just games, how he'd leave the king in his pocket like some guardian charm, how the game would only end when the king fell. Adrenaline surged, pushing me to grab a bag and instinctively shove some essentials into it, ready to flee whatever game had begun. But he was already there. Turning from the door, I felt a presence, a static in the air thick enough to taste, and there he stood, Lester, blotting out sameness like a silhouette against blinding light. His eyes held the same sad madness, but now they swirled with something deeper, a knowing beyond our world. "It's time," he uttered softly, the room warping around his voice. I tried to scream but the sound didn't come, choked off by terror twisting its noose around my throat. In a fluid motion, faster and more deliberate than his shuffling form suggested possible, he reached toward me while chanting a string of unfamiliar words. I staggered backward, my mind separating into shards of ice-cold fear, time slowing as if stretching to let the nightmare lengthen. He whispered about journeys through doors unseen by the naked eye, of roles fulfilled and games ending. I felt the tug at my consciousness, a seductive pull to something vast and incomprehensible, but my survival instinct kicked in, a primal roar drowning out his siren call. I grabbed the nearest object, a ceramic vase, and swung with every inch of self-preservation left in me. It shattered against the side of his head, more solid and real than I'd hoped, momentarily stunned. I dashed around him, hearing the shattered pieces crunching under his feet, yelling at my legs to carry me faster than they ever did in any track meet way back in high school. I collapsed into the driver's seat of my car, the engine roared to life, and I drove. I drove until the physical act of it burned into mindlessness, until the lines on the road blurred into a single stream, an escape from whatever cosmic joke I was part of. The radio crackled from the passenger seat, half functioning, metallic whispers breaking through bursts of static, taunting my certainty of reality. It's been hours, maybe days, since I absconded from my life, staying in motel rooms with flickering neon signs, calling friends to check on my sanity, only to hang up before they answer, unable to admit to anyone the madness unraveling me. Each night, as I lay down with the stolen king piece under my pillow, I hear him, feel his gaze from afar, pleading with me to finish what he started. The things he told me claw at the edges of my sanity, the glaring unseen now something I sense lurking behind each sound and shadow. I'm not sure how much longer I can resist it, or if, maybe, giving in would bring peace to this waking nightmare. If my story ends in a way that makes news, know it was never just him trying to kidnap me, it was me untethered from a world that lost its grip on reality. It was supposed to be a secret king, something hidden in the shadows of my mind where no judgment could ever touch it. But tonight, sitting alone under the dim glow of the single lamp in my apartment, I feel compelled to let it spill out into the world, like some kind of confession I should have whispered to my pillow instead of typing into the void of the internet. You see, it started about 6 months ago, not long after I moved into this small, creaky studio in the older part of town where the neighbors keep to themselves and the landlord barely remembers I exist. Every night, just after the clock would quietly announce retribution for the day's unfinished business, I'd hear it, the low hum of a vibrating phone, but heavier, more resonant, as if it echoed through the walls themselves. At first, I dismissed it as part of the ongoing battle I have with sleep. Insomnia and I are well acquainted. It creeps into my bed at night, whispering doubts and fears until my attempts to rest border on delusional. But that sound, that became something more. I would lie there, frozen, while the muffled, rhythmic buzz seemed to trace patterns in the air around me, each pulse resonating deep within my chest. It was on the third night that my curiosity overcame my fear, a fear I had not even acknowledged until I found myself peeking through the curtains, scanning the silent, deserted street below. Nothing. No one. The hum wound itself around the mundane creaks of the aging structure, twining with the distant radio noise that seeped through like water through porous rock from the apartment next door. It should have been unsettling, but instead, I felt something almost akin to comfort. This was the moment when a tingle of excitement and familiarity uncoiled within me, a strange pleasure that arose from a sound I could not source, an intangible call. There was something intimate about it, something that melded with the part of me that yearned for the mysterious and the forbidden, all in the safety of my snug, solitary life. Each night, I'd lay on the stiff mattress, letting the hum ripple through the uncertainty clouding my thoughts, until the tension in me unspooled, leaving behind a heavy, serene tranquility. It became a ritual I dared not disturb, fearing what breaking it would bring, the prospect of meeting something beyond my control or understanding. Yet as weeks morphed into months, this insistence on the unknown festered like an itch. I couldn't banish it, and the intrigue grew teeth. Odd fantasies erupted in my mind, adventurous scenarios of otherworldly visitors or hidden networks connecting our minds during that magical hour. But then, one evening, when the sky bled into an overcast twilight and I'd barely closed my eyes, something changed. The hum was different, it surged with irregularity, breaking its usual cadence with confused staccato bursts. Panic clawed its way up my spine as I sat up, clutching the sheets like a lifeline. The air thickened, charged, with an energy I couldn't explain but could somehow feel seeping into the marrow of my bones. A soft knock echoed from the front door, hesitant yet insistent. It halted the noise in my mind, replacing it with a deafening silence that bore down on me. Part of me whispered to leave it be, to stay wrapped in the known discomfort of unsure safety. But another part, one electrified with a perverse thrill, urged me to answer. The walk to the door felt elongated, moments stretched into tiny eternities filled with the sound of my pulse racing against the wall's vibrations. With a deep breath I swung the door open, expecting, what? A ghost, an alien perhaps? Instead, there stood an old man, weather-worn with eyes that seemed to hold galaxies of wisdom and despair. In one skeletal hand, he clutched an ancient cellular phone with rubber buttons worn down to nubs. He looked at me with an intensity that was both unnerving and strangely comforting. "I've been trying to reach someone," he said, his voice the very essence of forgotten echoes, "for a long time." We stood there, two souls on the brink of something neither of us could articulate, bound by this inexplicable thread. Without a word, he lifted the phone between us. Against every rational instinct, I let out a shaky breath, my hand drawn toward the device, as if it had been calling to me all along. And with that touch, a sensation like a jolt of electricity shot through my arm, a wave of understanding crashed over me. It wasn't just sound I was hearing, but the reflections of unspoken stories trapped in our shared atmosphere, the stories of those who lived, loved, and lost. Revelations flashed in my mind like claps of thunder, fragments of my own desires, regrets, and forgotten promises blended with his. A past filled with secrets and whispers I couldn't have understood until now enveloped me, filled the hollow parts within, a bond formed in the uncharted territory between us. The realization that someone, even a stranger linked by the spectral frequency, was able to comprehend that missing, aching piece of my spirit, turned the fear into something else. Something near ecstasy. It was at once terrifying and liberating to feel so seen. As tentative dawn light began filtering through the doorway, the old man nodded, and the vibrating ceased, leaving behind an overwhelming quietness that both soothed and unsettled my senses. I knew then that the unknown carried both the burden and embrace of discovery, and this sensation that might be jarring to others was a gift I could accept. I had faced the pulse of continuity and found within its depths a peculiar solace, a connection in the chaos, one sacred to those bold enough to confront the indefinable. I watched him turn and vanish into the shadows, leaving me alone again, yet not. A strange calm settled over me. I'm no longer sure if my confession was about him or the way that mystifying sound filled the emptiness inside me, but what I do know is, whatever strange thing it has awakened, it's not nearly as frightening as never having heard it at all. I should have known something was off about Jason when we first agreed to sign the lease together, but back then, my main concern was finding someone who would make the rent more bearable. He seemed nice enough, a bit quirky, perhaps, but hell, who isn't these days? The apartment was perfect, 2 spacious rooms, a cozy living room, and a kitchen with a refrigerator that didn't hum angrily, unlike the one in my crummy old studio. Early on, it seemed like I'd hit the jackpot, until I opened the freezer one night and found it packed to the brim with what looked like sealed dinner trays, each labeled with a date. Meal prepping is key to a healthy lifestyle, Jason had explained, his words punctuated by a nervous chuckle that I soon learned was his go-to when things got awkward. I didn't even think about it too much until the stack of those trays seemed to propagate like rabbits. What had started as a manageable annoyance turned into full-blown frustration as I realized my own supplies were relegated to one measly corner. Snack by snack, I watched my space dwindle. I tried avoiding confrontation. I really did. But let's face it, ramen and canned soup lose their charm quickly when that's all you have stored outside the freezer. One night, after a grueling day filled with the kind of endless meetings that sap your soul, I came home craving the simplicity of solitary dining comfort, a frozen pizza. That's when I decided it was time to have the talk. Jason, maybe it's time we start storing less so there's more room for everyone? I'd said as diplomatically as possible, but Jason's expression shifted in a way I couldn't quite read. It didn't seem angry, more like someone who just remembered they left the stove on. Or in his case, the freezer. He mumbled something about needing everything stored for documentation and hurried off to his room, leaving me standing there, frozen like the neglected dinner stuffed in our appliance. I decided to investigate. A quick shuffle through the neatly organized trays revealed something unsettling. Each label had a name, some I recognized as his ex-girlfriend Sarah's, his distant relatives I'd never met, and shockingly, even mine, dated the day we'd moved in. I wanted to believe it was some twisted quirk of his dietary plans, but the gnawing pit in my stomach told me otherwise. My instincts edged me to question the nature of those meals. I tried to track down Sarah, wanting to underline her name on Facebook only to find her profile inactive for months. That's when a deep unease settled in, the kind that douses your heart in cold dread and leaves you wallowing in paranoia. The next morning, I pretended to sleep in the living room, keeping one eye trained on the kitchen. At precisely 3 a.m., Jason emerged, moving with unsettling purpose toward the freezer. The pale refrigerator light cast strange shadows on his face as he extracted 3 trays, laying them out on the counter as if carefully selecting from a cursed deck of cards. I must have accidentally let out too loud a breath because he suddenly stiffened, his head turning slightly as though he sensed the pinprick stare of my barely closed eyes. Feigning a sleepy shuffle, I coughed and made a beeline for the bathroom, not daring to meet his eyes. I returned to the living room to find Jason gone and the trays missing. My thoughts raced. Should I confront him? Call the cops? I decided that a more subtle approach was needed, so I planted a small camera facing the kitchen, its eye trained upon the fridge's realm, hoping it would unearth some sanity to Jason's midnight ritual. That night, having inhaled enough caffeine to power a blender, I couldn't look away from the feed. The camera caught him again, this time tracing a finger over the trays, as though he were communing with each sealed package, his eyes, dull and absent. It wasn't until I replayed the footage in slow motion that I noticed the eerie thing. His lips were moving, forming soundless words too fast for me to decipher. I enlisted the help of a friend who worked in audio engineering, hopeful he could uncover the whispered secret. The dark revelation came 2 days later in the form of an email that left a chill crawling over my skin. Jason wasn't uttering benign pleasantries but rather, grotesque incantations, calling upon something that should have been left dormant. I knew I couldn't stay there, not with him and his frozen altars to entities I dared not comprehend. Before fleeing that night with a hastily packed bag, I made the mistake of seeking clarity, implying I was no longer comfortable with the arrangement. Jason's response was peculiar. It wasn't one of anger or despair, but relief, as if a burden had been gently lifted from his shoulders. He watched with unsettling composure as I exited the door, and it wasn't until weeks later, when police found my name etched into the ice on his final remaining tray, that I realized why. In his twisted ritual, it seemed sacrifice always needed a witness. Sam and I had been together for 3 years when I stumbled upon the first hint of our unraveling. A routine evening, the sun had just dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky in shades of navy and plum. Sam was in the shower when his phone buzzed on the kitchen counter, a notification so persistent it breached my attention as I mindlessly scrolled through social media. It was a message preview from an unknown contact. "Can't wait to see you again." I felt a cold weight settle in my stomach, a leaden weight that warned me against opening it, but my fingers moved independently of my conscience, interacting with the screen to reveal a conversation steeped in intimacy and lies. It turned out Sam had an entire life I wasn't aware of, a life textured with secret rendezvous, whispers on the phone, and affectionate exchanges with someone he described as the one who truly understands me, and messages he never expected me to see. My heart twisted, a visceral knot of betrayal, disbelief, and aching anger, as I scrolled through each exchange, vividly painting a picture of infidelity in my mind. Each word I read was a dagger, twisting and turning in a wound that would not close. Sam emerged from the shower, oblivious to the storm brewing beneath my calm facade. I confronted him in a soft voice, fearing my own rage. "Who is she?" I asked, my tone steady despite the quiver in my core. For a moment, Sam's expression held genuine surprise, which quickly melted into the contrived demeanor he donned when caught out, a well-rehearsed mix of contrition and rationalization. "It's not what it looks like," he stammered, averting his gaze, trying to reclaim supremacy over a script that he'd lost control of. But perhaps the most chilling part of it all was how easily he slipped into the role of the aggrieved, victimized by circumstance itself. "I was going to tell you," he claimed, a lie rehearsed down to the furrow of his brows, "but things got complicated." His words were as hollow as they were perfunctory, staining the space between us with insincerity. I wish the betrayal ended there, a transgression found, confronted, and left to flounder in the past. But Sam's treachery was a many-headed beast. A few weeks later, as I sat alone in silence, cobbling together the frayed threads of trust with flimsy determination, the police arrived at our door. "Is this a good time, miss?" the officers asked, their uniforms etched with authority and edges of concern. The question bounced around my mind like a rubber ball in an empty room. Nothing about any of this was good. The officers, a man and a woman, proceeded to unfold a narrative that was like hearing a nightmare with waking ears. Sam was wanted for questioning in connection to a fraud investigation, tied up in expensive hobbies and the kind of reckless spendings that ordinary lives cannot accommodate without consequence. Among the list of transgressions was his artful deception in siphoning funds from my savings account, our savings account, he always insisted. A pool of pooled resources evaporated under his dripping deceit. Those quiet, chilling evenings post-revelation were some of the loneliest I've ever endured. I couldn't keep the tears from coming, an incessant stream of despair that threatened to drown me in their relentless tide. I filed through his possession like a detective, no, worse, a scorned lover, each artifact of his belonging inseminated with dark secrets and untold betrayals. Samuel Worthington, the quintessential partner I'd trusted and loved, materialized as a master illusionist whose greatest trick was that he ever loved me at all. But revelations were not limited to heartbreak. Digging deeper into Sam's duplicity was like opening Pandora's box. I found envelopes filled with false documents, an old laptop that had served as a hub for networks I couldn't comprehend, yet feared for their import. The more I uncovered, the wider the scope of Sam's betrayals spanned. It was as though beneath our quite meticulously curated life lay darker labyrinthine corridors he never wanted me to find, corridors filled with echoes of past indiscretions and the uncanny scent of moral decay. Rumors spread quickly once Sam's misdemeanors became public. Our neighborhood, once a bastion of community spirit, buzzed with whispered judgments and cautionary tales. "Did you hear?" they would mutter, watching me through lowered lids. "You never really know someone, do you?" They were right, and that truth was a festering wound I lived with daily. Sam fled, the coward that he was, abandoning me to the unpleasant aftertaste of our shared history, and the cold shoulders of once friends. Days blurred into one another as I battled through legal ramifications that were mine only by association, but no less impactful. I hired a private investigator, not as an act of vengeance, but to understand who this stranger I'd loved truly was. Aided by professionals who specialized in truths brought to light from shadowy pasts, the investigator unspooled a lifetime of deception. I learned of the other aliases Sam used, identities he assumed with unsettling ease to slip in and out of boundaries society failed to recognize. His exploits spanned beyond fraud, into territories darker than I dared to imagine, predation, theft, and a misuse of trust so vile, its movie script-like quality belied its reality. Yet the louder story seemed to weave its own narrative, whispering tales of deceit until Sam was more ghost than man, vanishing into obscurity as clandestine as his love was false. Friends I'd known, and who thought they'd known Sam as well, vacillated between pity and avoidance, unwilling to introduce such corruption into their pristine lives. But their cautious distance was nothing compared to the silence that followed the media attention his case attracted, when I watched talking heads deliberate over his villainy, talking as though he was no more than a plot, a scripted tale of human folly. Every mention of his name was like a stab in the side, a reminder of wounds too fresh to heal. In their wake, I became both infamous and infamous, someone known only in the margin of someone else's headline story. Alone, while screens blared his misdeeds, I internally screamed for answers that no longer mattered. In my ongoing solitude, I prepared myself to confront a reality where closure might never exist, an existence diminished by someone else's supposed love. But as I closed the book on our once happy partnership, I realized the most important chapter lay ahead. I retreated into the familiar comfort of anonymity, reclaiming corners of the life Sam had sought to dismantle. Piece by piece, I rediscovered myself amidst the rubble of his betrayals. It was a slow, unraveling journey, punctuated by brushes with intrusive memories, but forward was the only direction left to me. I told and retold my story to myself, the words losing weight with each iteration, freeing me from their grip. Sam's confession, as much a condemnation of his character as a grim realization of my own blindness, was the weapon I wielded to carve out a life shaped by unyielded resilience. And so I emerged, not unscathed, but braver in my tarnished skin, afraid still of the shadows others might cast, yet emboldened by the light I could orchestrate myself. A whisper of my story calls to me now. It is time for the closed to reopen, for the forgotten to remain as lessons branded into my soul. So, Sam, wherever you are, hear me clearly. You're a terrible person and a terrible partner. But in your selfish departure, you inadvertently taught me how to recognize strength where it lay dormant. So thank you, I suppose, for waking me up from a dream disguised as a nightmare, echoing lessons only learned through facing the dark. Ever since the accident, the echoes of blame have reverberated through our quiet suburban house, vibrating through its walls with a menacing persistence that no amount of silence could quell. It all started on a lazy Sunday afternoon when our 9-year-old daughter, Emily, decided she wanted to try out her new rollerblades. The sun was bright, casting a hopeful glow over our cul-de-sac, and I was lounging in the backyard, half listening to Emily's gleeful shrieks while my wife, Sarah, was inside occupied with her baking. Emily had been begging for rollerblades for weeks, swearing she'd learned it from watching her friends. I admit I was skeptical, her legs wobbly like a newborn deer whenever she tried balancing on those wheels. But today was different, she was determined, and I figured a little outdoor activity wouldn't hurt. But as I relaxed in my chair, letting the rhythmic creak of a swinging hammock lull me, I heard the unmistakable, heart-stopping scream. I jumped, rushing to the front yard where I found her lying on the asphalt, clutching her arm bent at an unnatural angle, her eyes wide with terror and pain. Time seemed to fragment as Sarah appeared at the door, her expression morphing from confusion to horror in the blink of an eye. We spent the next several hours navigating the sterile corridors of the local hospital, the doctor's voice low murmur about fractured bones and surgeries while Emily whimpered in her hospital bed. Beside me, Sarah teetered between composed reassurance for our daughter and a seething anger directed at me. It was as if I'd personally fashioned the ground to rise up and meet Emily, rather than a freak accident. We were buzzed with adrenaline, each of us taking turns to stand by Emily's side until exhaustion took us by the hand and led us to the uncomfortable plastic chairs in the waiting room. It was there that Sarah's patience fractured. A quiet argument broke out, a whisper curse over who was to blame. She accused me of negligence, of not watching closely enough. Her words were daggers wrapped in hushed tones, wielded silently but lethally. I countered, arguing that kids fall, kids get hurt, it's all part of growing up. But her eyes, usually so full of warmth, were cold and hard as winter ice, and her voice was a scant thread of composure away from a hysterical break. The door creaked as a nurse stepped out to reassure us that Emily was in good hands now, but it did little to thaw the glacial distance forming between us. Returning home, the house felt like an eerie, unfamiliar place, a shell housing the ghosts of laughter that used to resonate between its walls. Sarah moved through routines mechanically, her presence quiet but edged sharply against everything warm and forgiving. We barely talked, and when we did, it always wormed its way back to that day. I realized quickly that Sarah sought a scapegoat for her guilt, a tangible foe to fight rather than the uncontrollable chaos of life. Her days were peppered with phone calls to her friends and family, Each conversation underscored by whispers and silent judgments I could feel in every side glance the community cast my way. Soon am I the asshole? Was a thought that chased me down hallways and slipped into my dreams, a question that twisted in my gut whenever I tried to rationalize my actions. Weeks later, the tension had solidified into a palpable entity. Our house felt inhabited by an unspoken wrath. Sarah remained curt, interactions reduced to the perfunctory exchange of essential information. Conversations at the dinner table with Emily, now with her arm in a neon pink cast, were stilted and uncomfortable, the cheer she once brought diluted into politeness. I watched as Sarah's attitude seeped into Emily's perception. She grew tentative, her laughter muted, seeking her mother's approval with desperation that broke my heart. I knew I had to force a confrontation, to challenge the narrative being built around me. One night, long after Emily was tucked into bed and the overcast sky draped our house in shadows, I decided to clear the air. We stood in the dimly lit kitchen, the refrigerator's hum filling the silence as Sarah meticulously dried dishes. I poured out everything I'd been keeping inside, acknowledging my oversight without shouldering all the blame. The kitchen's dim light cast long shadows that seemed to stretch like the truth between us. As I spoke, Sarah's expression began to shift, bit by bit cracking the ice that encased her empathy. Frustration and fatigue melted into sorrow, her eyes welling with tears that had been wrongfully dammed by pride and anger. She admitted to being terrified of losing control, of the world's tendency to unfurl in chaos, and the paralyzing fear that Emily's accident had brought. It was a mother's worst fear realized. We were two people navigating the trauma of parenthood, bound by love yet ripped by anxiety over the safety of our child. The air between us, thick with blame and misunderstanding, slowly lifted as we recognized the burdens each carried invisibly. We embraced, a silent apology passing between us that mere words could never articulate. We promised to rebuild, brick by unsteady brick, the structure of understanding that stood cracked in our marriage. Emily needed parents who picked each other up after a fall, not ones who stayed sprawled on the pavement of guilt and recrimination. As the morning light spilled into the kitchen, illuminating the dust motes that danced merrily in its glow, Sarah and I sat close, sipping weak coffee, and for the first time since Emily's accident, that oppressive question didn't carry the same weight. It was as if opening our souls to vulnerability had released a specter, allowing us to coexist as joint guardians of our daughter against the unpredictable whirl of life. Gradually, conversations normalized, and Emily began rolling her eyes at our dad jokes, her cast a badge of bravery she loved showing off. In the end, it wasn't about siding with anyone, it was about finding security in a world of uncertainty, the realization that we could falter and still be each other's anchor in the storm. The first time I heard them, I dismissed it as an unsettling dream, but the screams chased me into wakefulness, clawing at the edges of my sanity. I live alone with my teenage son, Ethan, in a dilapidated two-story house, where creaking floorboards and sighing walls sing a chorus of loneliness. It was a Thursday night, long past midnight, when the silence was torn asunder by a cacophony of cries, echoing in the inky blackness outside my window. They were not just any screams but heart-wrenching, visceral wails filled with despair and agony, as if somebody's soul was being ripped asunder. I shot up in bed, heart racing, a cold sweat plastering my shirt to my skin. Perhaps it was a nightmare, I convinced myself, breathing deeply, trying to quell the panic roaring in my chest. But as the minutes crept by, the screams persisted, coming in waves, and with each one, the notion of dreaming faded into the background of a dreadful reality. Ethan was the next person I turned to, hoping to find solace in the fact that he too heard the haunting cries. When I rushed into his room, I found him sitting upright in bed, his eyes wide, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his face. Yet, when I questioned him, his response was disconcerting. "Mom, you're just hearing things," he said with a dismissive turn of his head, his voice low and unfazed. "You're not well. Maybe you should see someone." His words cut deeper than the screams themselves, sticking into me like a barbed hook. Could he really not hear what seemed so deafening to me? I left his room, feeling a creeping chill settle into my bones, an eerie sense kneading at the fringes of my thoughts. Maybe Ethan was right. I slumped back into bed, hypnotized by the relentless rhythm of the cries until exhaustion took me under. But the next morning, serenity greeted me with such deceptive bliss, you'd assume the night before never unleashed horrors upon me. Yet the unease remained, nestled in the back of my mind, stoking the fires of my doubt. Ethan carried on with his morning routine with a peculiar nonchalance that seemed almost artificial, and I watched him with a scrutinizing eye, as if trying to discern some crack in his demeanor. It was Saturday by then, which meant spending the day under the same roof, and tension hummed just beneath the surface. As evening drew its inky curtain over the town again, I braced myself for the recurrence of those screams, my unwanted companions. They returned, predictably, as if on cue with the passing of midnight, their intensity unyielding. A familiar dread coursed through my veins, louder now, taunting, mocking. Ethan, meanwhile, continued his act of ignorance, a facade that began to fray my nerves. I confronted him, desperate, hoping for some acknowledgement, a shred of belief in my experience. "Mom, seriously, you're scaring me," he said, his eyes glazed, yet his voice laced with an undercurrent of irritation rather than concern. His insistence on my delusions began gnawing at my credibility, bending my perception of reality. Was I truly spiraling into some uncharted insanity? Or was something more sinister silencing him? Days bled into nights, each one mirroring the last in a macabre symphony of screams and silence. I found myself wandering the house at night, pacing the corridors like a restless specter, clutching a kitchen knife, the razor-sharp cold comfort against the opaque terror outside. On particularly brutal nights, the screams seemed to emanate from within the house itself, reverberating through the walls like a malignant presence. Driven by desperation, I turned to more drastic measures, delving into every potential source of the noise, casting accusations at our antiquated plumbing, the cantankerous howl of the wind, even clandestine intruders manipulating our minds. Yet each deduction crumbled under scrutiny, leaving nothing but raw fear. The question now was not whether the screams were real, but why only I perceived them. Then, seeking validation outside our home, I reached out to neighbors, children linked to that very atmosphere, who, too, claimed they heard nothing unusual. Confusion escalated into paranoia, every shadow seemed an apparition, every corner a breathing entity plotting its unveiling. As a last resort, I rigged the house with recording devices hoping to capture the elusive veil, leaving them running overnight. But dawn broke my last tether to reality. The tapes captured silence, an ambient void untouched by my nocturnal horrors. Convinced I was on the brink of madness, I hesitated to revisit Ethan's claims of my illness. Was my mind betraying me, curating a desecrated phantom show? My paranoia reached a fever pitch, each scream a crescendo in the symphony unraveling my mind. I considered admitting myself for psychiatric evaluation, perhaps there lay my salvation, when a troubling thought struck me. What if Ethan was orchestrating a grand deceit, manipulating my perception of reality? Could this detached coolness cloak something deeper? One night, resolved and driven by bloodhound instinct, I followed my son as he slipped quietly into the shadows of his room. Silently, I watched through the crack of his door as he placed an odd device against the wall, a makeshift speaker of sorts, a detail sharpened in the haze of moonlight filtering through a window. My heart pounded like a war drum against my ribs as a bracing revelation vibrated through me. Could it be, Ethan was the architect behind this haunting soundtrack, entrapping me in narratives of sickness while subverting reality? Questions brewed within, but I didn't confront him just yet. Instead, I waited for nightfall when he thought I was asleep. That Saturday, as the clock approached midnight, I snuck into his room, prepared to witness whatever sick game he waged. The device whirred softly under his palm as I stepped closer, a dull mechanical heart driving the screams into our walls, feeding their spectral lifeblood. "Ethan," I whispered, and his body jerked in acknowledgement, the device slipping, crashing into silence. The raw shock on his face reflected the madness simmering within the walls of our house, a betrayal that transcended mere explanation. Everything I knew twisted in an instant, a kaleidoscope world fragmented, and the promise of sanity dangled beyond reach. My son's eyes conveyed fear, malice, or perhaps a protectiveness that did not align with the reality I'd constructed. "Why?" I croaked, a plea for comprehension, a question expecting nothing more than confession. Breathing heavily, Ethan whispered, "I wish you didn't force me to this, Mom. You don't realize how sick you are. I'm trying to help." With those words, my universe collapsed. The madness was not just external but coursed within, his reality casting doubt on mine. Was this his attempt at obliterating illusions I had spun? The boundary between truth and deception dissolved, and I found myself alone in unescapable labyrinths of conviction and delusion. Perhaps the screams weren't a figment of the physical world but manifestations meant to cure me in some brutal, uncharted therapy. I stumbled back into my room, the device. Ethan's revelation continued casting shadows long after the screams ceased. As I lay in the dark, there was no solace, only a growing awareness that the screams, whether brought on through deception or disturbance, were a clarion call upon my very soul, signaling that beneath this veneer of normalcy, something far more unhinged awaited its turn. I need to start by saying I never believed in curses or anything supernatural, But if my experience has taught me anything, it's that some things are better left unexplored. A couple of months ago, during a yard sale spree with my friend Jason, we stumbled upon an intriguing item, a wooden box, covered in intricate carvings with symbols neither of us recognized. The old man selling it claimed it was a dibbook box, and laughed off our questions, saying it was for curious minds. Jason challenged me to buy it as a joke, but I decided to take the plunge. I wish I hadn't. When I got home, the air inside my apartment felt heavier, but I brushed it off as fatigue. That evening, out of sheer boredom, I decided to open the box. Inside, I found strange trinkets, a rusty key, a lock of hair, and a small parchment paper with Hebrew writing. I'm not sure what compelled me to, but I whispered the words written on the parchment out loud. That's when everything started going downhill. The first sign was mild, a series of terrible nightmares, ones where I was running through endless corridors as unseen entities laughed in the shadows. I shrugged them off as a product of stress until I heard my mom had a freak accident the next day. She slipped down the stairs and ended up with a severe head injury. I tried to rationalize it, yet my gut twisted with an odd sense of dread. It was just the beginning. The following week, my sister's fiancé was struck by a car. The tragedy seemed unwarranted, as he was always so careful. My family was starting to fray at the edges, snapping at each other out of grief and despair. I couldn't push aside the connection between the box and these horrors. Jason scoffed at my concern, telling me I was going insane, until a raging fire broke out in his apartment from a mysterious electrical fault. He's now in a hospital with second-degree burns. My heart sank deeper into an abyss of guilt with each devastating phone call. My paranoia escalated when I heard whispers in my own apartment, wordless at first, but soon I began discerning voices calling my name. I barricaded the box in the attic, but the sinister energy seeped into every crevice of my life. Searching for answers, I dove into cryptic forums and old texts, desperate for a solution. One late night, I came across a post by a rabbi who spoke of the risks of opening a dibbook box, warning of malevolent entities that cling to the living, feasting on their suffering. Hemmed in by despair, I finally reached out to him. During our call, he instructed me on how to cleanse the box. I needed a mix of salt and sage and had to recite a protective incantation. In a frenzy, I assembled the materials. When I was ready, I climbed to the attic, each step echoing with a foreboding hum. The air was thick with something that felt alive, watching. My spine tingled as I began the incantation. I felt a chill rising through the room, shadows swirling along the walls, the whispers reaching a crescendo. The candles flickered, and just as I was about to lose hope, the box snapped shut with a horrid finality, the air suddenly clear. I stumbled back, drenched in sweat and tears. An overwhelming sense of relief washed over me, but I knew the damage was irreversible. The rabbi assured me over a cracked voice call that the entity was sealed back in. The accidents mysteriously halted, the oppressive aura lifting from my family's shoulders. But I'm haunted every single day by the faces of my loved ones, those still suffering from scars that won't heal, and the memory of Jason's burned skin. I never dared to touch the box again. It lies buried in a cursed spot known only to me, under heavy stones somewhere far from humanity's reach. Consider this a cautionary tale. Some histories should remain untouched. If you ever encounter a dibbook box, I beg you, leave it be. For your own sake, and for everyone you hold dear.